On a beautiful and sunny day, a passenger plane takes off from Dallas, heading to London. The pilots on board are William and Daniel. At first, the flight proceeds smoothly, but after a short while, the flight instruments start behaving strangely. William immediately contacts ground control, but they are told that the skies are clear and they should continue the flight. Just as the pilots think they can relax, a massive storm suddenly appears in front of them. Yet, ground control had firmly stated just seconds earlier that there was no such storm. With no other choice, they are forced to fly through the storm. William informs the passengers that they will experience turbulence. As the plane plunges into the storm, it begins to shake violently, and while they pass through, the storm is strangely glowing. After a while, the plane stabilizes again and continues to fly normally. However, the pilots are utterly astonished, because the sky has suddenly turned pitch black. William tries to calm the passengers by saying that this is a strange effect that occurs when flying over the Bermuda Triangle. Still, the passengers begin to worry, because their phones and computers can no longer connect to anything. In the cockpit, most of the flight systems have also shut down, and William cannot communicate with ground control. However, since the radar is still working, the pilots decide that this is sufficient for now and continue the flight. Meanwhile, the cabin crew begins the beverage service and asks everyone not to worry, assuring them that this is just normal turbulence. An employee on the plane named Cameron strikes up a conversation with two men. He learns that these people are historians and hears that they are going to London to examine some newly discovered wartime artifacts. There is also an elderly man on the plane. He carefully writes down every detail of what happens to him in his notebook. A short while later, the pilots notice that there are no other planes on their radar. This is quite alarming, because the storm may have thrown them off course. William decides to fly the plane in a circular route in hopes of finding someone. When they begin to descend, they can't recognize anything outside. Just then, something appears on their radar. At first, they think it's another storm, but the truth is much more disturbing. The radar is filled with warplanes bombing a city. It's as if they've fallen right into the middle of an active war. The passengers start to panic when they see the buildings below the plane exploding and everything engulfed in flames. However, even amid this chaos, historians notice a rather interesting detail. The pilots, on the other hand, become unsure of what to do. But before they can even consider their options, warplanes suddenly appear around them. These planes are about to open fire on the aircraft. However, thanks to the radar, William manages to quickly pull the plane up and save it from danger. The passengers grow increasingly tense and expect an explanation. Cameron does his best to calm them down. William tries to re-establish contact with ground control, but to no avail. So he decides to descend again. His goal is to figure out where they are. Daniel initially objects to this decision, because there is a chance they might be attacked again. However, William says that they are running low on fuel and need to find a solution quickly. Just then, the historians tell Cameron that they are suspicious about some things and ask him to take them to the cockpit to see the pilots, convincing him. However, there is something Cameron is unaware of. Michael secretly follows them and listens in on their conversation. The historians tell the pilots that the fighter planes they just encountered have not been produced since 1945, and that these planes belonged to the Luftwaffe, the Air Force of Nazi Germany. At first, William does not take this claim seriously and wants to get them out of the cockpit. But the historians suspect that the plane is no longer receiving any signals, and this information catches William's attention. According to the historians, the plane has traveled back in time and is now in the middle of World War II. If this event happened due to an anomaly, they will need to find traces of a similar anomaly in order to return. Although the idea of time travel still seems absurd to William, as he sends them back to their seats, he firmly tells them not to share this theory with anyone. Michael, Cameron, and the historians return to their seats immediately before reaching the cockpit. The historians are trying to make sense of what happened using the books and calculations they brought with them. Meanwhile, the pilots decide to descend again. Their goal is to pick up any radio signal. Fortunately, this time luck is on their side, and they manage to make contact with an English soldier named Nigel. However, since Nigel finds it impossible for a plane flying at such a high altitude to transmit a radio signal, he suspects they are spies and becomes suspicious. While the pilots beg for help, William directly asks what the date is. When Nigel says it's June 17, 1940, the historian's theory is officially confirmed. The pilots try to explain their situation to Nigel, but naturally, this story doesn't sound believable. Fortunately, the historians step in again. They say they've roughly calculated their position and that they just flew over the area where the British ship Lancaster was sunk. This information shocks Nigel, because that ship should still be active. In other words, this information is something from the future. Nigel decides to check this information with his superiors and promises to return. Meanwhile, while the historians' seats are empty, Michael secretly takes their books and finally puts all the pieces together. Realizing the truth, Michael stands up angrily and shouts to the other passengers, telling them what has happened. He says that they are now right in the middle of World War II in the past, and with the information they have, they could kill Hitler and stop the war. Most of the passengers laugh at his crazy words and don't take him seriously. However, a few people believe what he says and decide to support him by helping to take over the cockpit. Fortunately, there are also 2 American soldiers traveling as passengers on the plane, and they quickly intervene in the situation. They clearly state that, regardless of the intention, attempting to take over the cockpit is considered an act of terrorism. These words further escalate the tension, and a fight breaks out. Even the cabin crew step in. As punches fly, the soldiers gain the upper hand. They neutralize the attackers, send them back to their seats, and by sternly warning the other passengers, they manage to keep everyone under control. Minutes later, Nigel reconnects and says that the information about the Lancastria turned out to be correct, and that thanks to this, many people were saved. He now trusts them. However, Nigel also notes that some parts of the war are unfolding differently than what historians have written in their books. This shows that the plane is not only traveling to the past, but to an alternative version of the past. Nigel is ready to help the plane land. But first, he needs to know exactly where they are. Unfortunately, William and the historians can only provide an approximate location. So Daniel turns on the plane's lights so that the British soldiers can see them. But at that moment, the Germans are listening to these conversations and immediately give the order to attack. Soon the plane is surrounded by fighter aircraft. The target is clear. The plane will be shot down immediately. William quickly turns off the lights and, while all the passengers scream in panic, he uses his expert piloting skills to dodge the bullets. However, as the intensity of the gunfire increases, it becomes harder to endure. So, with a sudden maneuver, he puts the plane into a free fall. After a few seconds of deadly silence, he regains control of the plane just before it crashes into the ground. The German planes pursue him. However, the old model planes can't perform the maneuvers William does, and most of them crash to the ground. Still, 2 German planes survive and open fire on the cabin. Daniel is shot. Holes appear in the fuselage of the plane. As William manages to get out of enemy range, the cabin crew rushes in, plugs the holes, and administers first aid to Daniel using their training. William grows increasingly worried as their fuel is almost depleted and the landing gear is damaged. He also can't re-establish contact with Nigel. At this point, Cameron persuades him. He needs to speak to the passengers and ask for their support so they can act together. Meanwhile, the high-ranking officer Nigel reports to give him one final warning. If there is no news from the mysterious plane soon, it will be destroyed before it can fall into German hands. On the other hand, William leaves the controls to Daniel for a short while and comes to the cabin to speak with the passengers. At this point, there's no reason to hide the truth anymore. He explains everything openly. He says that he's been trying to land the plane, but during the last attack, the landing gear was damaged, and it's impossible to land without repairing it. They need their help. Teresa, who is among the passengers, volunteers to help by saying that she is an engineer. Seeing this courage, a skilled man named Hector also immediately volunteers. William heads to the back of the plane with his new team. Fortunately, Teresa quickly identifies the problem and, together with Hector, they get to work on the repairs. When the procedure is complete, Teresa opens the door, but the landing gear still doesn't come out. Because something is stuck. William offers to go down, but Hector stops him. The captain has to fly the plane, so he decides to take on the task himself. Hector carefully climbs onto the landing gear and, with the help of a hammer, fixes the problem. The wheel finally moves, but Hector almost falls. Fortunately, he holds on tight and the wheel locks into place. The operation is completed without anyone getting hurt. William quickly returns to the cockpit, and together with Daniel, they descend again to try to catch the radio signal. At last, they make contact with Nigel. William reports that there are only 80 minutes of fuel left and that they now urgently need to land. But the conversation is cut short, because the 2 German fighter planes they had previously damaged have returned and are attacking again. This time, the planes fire missiles. A missile explodes very close to the plane and shatters all the windows. While the passengers scream in panic, William uses the radar to track the positions of the enemy planes. Thanks to this, he performs incredible maneuvers and eventually the German planes crash into each other and go down. After the danger has passed, the historians come up with a new idea. They should remove the plane's radar and send it to Nigel. That way, Nigel can guide the plane to a safe place using the radar. The passengers and historians are surprised that such radar technology didn't exist in this era. Perhaps the reason the plane was sent to the past is to make up for the lack of this technology. Just then, a missile hits one of the plane's engines and the plane begins to fall rapidly. The pilots fail several times, but eventually they manage to restart the engine. They immediately re-establish contact with Nigel and agree on a location where they can drop the radar package. Soon after, it turns out that the missile was actually fired by the British Army. However, Nigel contacts his superiors, gets them to cease fire, and sends them out to retrieve the radar package. Everyone on the plane works together to prepare the radar package. An old man donates the toy parachutes he bought for his grandchildren. Some passengers also hand over their portable USB batteries. The radar is wrapped in clothing, placed in a bag, and combined with the parachutes. When they reach the correct coordinates, the package is dropped from the plane and Nigel is immediately informed. But the Nazis are also listening to this conversation and reach the area before the British. A Nazi soldier starts climbing the tree where the package got stuck. Just then, British soldiers arrive at the scene and a firefight breaks out. This time, luck is on their side. The British soldiers neutralize the Nazis one by one and finally seize the package successfully. But things are not over yet. The Nazis send more fighter planes to track William's aircraft. One of these planes hits the side of the aircraft and creates a large hole. Some passengers fall out through this hole. As the plane shakes violently, William once again manages to regain control with an extraordinary maneuver and moves the plane to a safe area. As soon as Nigel receives the radar, he sets it up and starts plotting a safe route for William. However, the Nazi planes continue to approach. Just as they are about to open fire, a British fighter plane sent by Nigel arrives to help and attacks the enemy planes. Thus, the passenger plane can safely continue on its way. Nigel sees a giant shadow of unknown origin on the radar screen. As the plane gets closer, they realize that it is not an aircraft, but a giant storm similar to the one that transported them to the past. Although this is a huge risk, since they are out of fuel, William decides to take this chance. After bidding farewell to Nigel, he warns the passengers to hold on tightly. Then William and Daniel fly the plane directly into the storm. After violent turbulence, the moment everyone has been waiting for finally arrives. At last, they manage to return to the present day. When they return, they realize the plane is over the skies of Berlin. Fortunately, ground control immediately contacts them and prepares an empty runway for them to land. The pilots push the limits of the plane to land and bring everyone safely to the ground. Relieved to be home, the passengers quickly leave the plane. William also leaves the cockpit and something catches his attention. The old man is still sitting in his seat, writing in his notebook. In the notebook he holds, there is a map resembling the route they just followed, and at the top of the page is the title, "The Radar System That Saved Europe." As the old man closes the notebook, his name becomes visible. Nigel, in other words, the very British soldier who saved them in 1940, is actually on this plane.